Let's start with the basics. The three traditional schools of Buddhism: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. And they all share core teachings. So they all teach the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. And I don't personally think these are incompatible with Navayana Buddhism, but they all see those as a guide out of personal suffering. They believe in karma and rebirth. Now, karma in Buddhism is very different from karma in Hinduism or indeed in Sikhism, but it still is taught in a way which suggests that the way we behave affects our birth into a next life and a life after that. As it is in traditional Buddhism, social liberation and equality or equity are the goals of Navayana Buddhism. Spiritual liberation is simply the first step that allows us to be more equipped to fight for social liberation. Recast Buddhism. He created Navayana, which literally means the new vehicle, a Buddhism for liberation of oppression, not liberation from reincarnation. He took this seriously. He took many years from deciding to convert to Buddhism to formally and publicly converting. He learned and studied Pali, the language believed to be, or closest to being, the language that the Buddha spoke. And he then wrote a book which he referred to as a Bible of Buddhism. Now, I don't think he meant it in the evangelical or fundamentalist way, but he wrote this book because he felt like within Buddhism there were so many different texts, there's so much writing, there's these baskets, as it were, of text and these different threads of text. And he felt that that was quite intimidating and overwhelming, but also it gave him a chance to overhaul and demystify some of the stories and to re-emphasize some and under-emphasize others. So he wrote a book called The Buddha and His Dhamma, and that book is like a Bible for Navayana Buddhists in the sense that the text that inspires and is the foundation for, but is not meant to be an authority over the Buddhist. Navayana Buddhism then teaches that Nirvana isn't something that you kind of reach to one day, maybe not this life, but in 10 lifetimes time, and you constantly practice, but you never get there. Nirvana isn't some carrot on the end of dangling on the end of a stick that you chase after. Nirvana is much more pragmatic than that in terms of your realization. So attachment then is a foundational Buddhist idea, and I'm not going to mess with it, I'm just going to extend it. The idea that we are attached to, well, we are attached to our own happiness, as it were. So when we are happy, attachment causes us to suffer because we know that our happiness will end, and we suffer that knowledge because we want to grasp at, and that word can mean not just attachment, also grasping. We grasp at the present moment when we are happy because we never want it to end. When we love people, we're attached to them, and that causes us suffering because we will part from them one day, and we know that, or we experience it at some point. Or we attach ourselves to living, to our own mortality, and we suffer because we know we are going to die. So attachment causes suffering. When we're in pain, we don't recognize the temporariness of that. That is simply sensation. And so our pain causes us suffering because we extend it out into the future, and we are attached to the idea that we aren't in pain. So attachment is really about the longing for stability and the longing for things to stay good and the same. And that causes what's in Pali dukkha, or often translated as suffering or affliction, or just this hungering for things to be good all the time, and that stability. And we see this played out in politics. And this is where I want to come to one of my favorite philosophers of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt. Hannah Arendt said, the point is, and this is in her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. Hannah Arendt, by the way, she was a Jewish refugee from Germany during the time of the rise of the Reich. So she knew what it meant to be under a totalitarian regime. So in The Origins of Totalitarianism, she says, the point is that both Hitler and Stalin held out promises of stability in order to hide their intention of creating a state of permanent instability. And we see this now in modern dictators, I would argue as well. The constant creation of chaos while constantly promising to make things stable or conserve something. You know, for Trump, it's about conserving white supremacy, conserving the power of some over others, conserving the American dream, whatever it happens to be, to bringing back the thing that they thought brought them stability in the 50s, you know, industrial factories, whatever it happens to be, while at the same time constantly sowing chaos. And that desire, that attachment, that grasping causes people to vote for somebody who promises them, I will keep things for you stable. As you see things slipping through your fingers in America, in the great American dream, it's slipping through your fingers, I will stop that from happening. I will stop and reverse all of this ebbing away of things that were. And dictators, and Arendt says this as well, dictators often love beauty and order and want to keep things the same. And they often think of their ideologies as good, as morally good, and they want to hold those things as permanent. And it's that desire, I believe, to make institutions or ideologies permanent that leads to political suffering. Because those ideologies or institutions become more important than human beings. And human beings are sacrificed because of the cause or the common good or the ideology. We see it in capitalism, we see it in communism, we see it now where the climate and the environment are being sacrificed over an ideology of market forces. People saying we can't afford to do anything about climate change are people who are saying there's this thing which we have to save at all costs. We've got capitalism, and well, now feudalism and modern feudalism, and we have to keep those things, and nothing can get in the way of that. And so that desire, that attachment, that grasping to ideologies, institutions causes dukkha, social dukkha. And so as we start to socialize and politicize explicitly the Buddhist ideas, we start to be able to understand the world differently, I think, and to see that what we need actually in order to be liberated as societies, as nations, and nations is another thing that we see as permanent. We wrongly see nation states as permanent, and that's patriotism. Patriotism is a grasping and an attachment to an institution of the nation. Buddhism sees patriotism as Upadana of the nation state, a grasping and attachment to my great country. And the way it is, or the way it was. So in Britain, we had this idea of take back control, which those who voted for take back control believed that they were taking back control of their democracy from the European Union. Those who were promoting take back control and funding it, what meant we are taking back control for corporations against voters. So there are two very different interpretations, but both were grasping at something. One was to preserve the power of the elites. One was to preserve some 1950s or 1960s idea of Britain. But both were forms of upadana. And it is only when we realize that all things pass away, all institutions, all ideologies are temporary. They are they're non-selves. It's only when we realize that we are able to avoid that kind of political suffering and challenge it. And so Navayana Buddhism, I believe, opens up those kind of opportunities for us. It does leave me with a dilemma, though, because nearly all Navayana Buddhists, or all the ones I've ever heard of or met, all Navayana Buddhists are from particular ethnic groups. They're mostly Mahas, but they are all Shudras, Dalits, untouchables in some form or other. I'm massively intrigued and inspired by Navayana Buddhism, but what do I do with that personally? Like, do I become a Navayana Buddhist, or is that me appropriating something which is very cultural? Or do I take some of that and then just, as an individual, explore it on my own? Well, or create something new. I'm not interested in starting some new religion or new denomination. But equally, I want to be part of community, Sangha, as it were, because as a Buddhist, you take refuge in the Sangha. So what does it mean for me, where I am so attracted to this form of Navayana Buddhism, to take refuge in the Sangha when everybody else in that bit of the Sangha is from a particular ethnic and language group, which isn't the same as mine? I have begun to reach out to Navayana Buddhists in Britain. I think I need to do more of that. Thanks for being part of this conversation. I'd love to hear from you and your journey too.